Going live. All right. So, hello, chat. I'm about to bring us live with our guest. I'm sure chat will start to show up over the next few minutes, but for now, I'd like to introduce James Meickle. I believe I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah.
Is coming on to talk about mutual aid, especially needed in this age of pandemic, and what it sort of means to do this local organizing to help people in their times of need when the government didn't really show up. So here we go. I believe there we are. You are on. All
Excellent.
right.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So, we first met, surprisingly, probably a while ago, because now that I know all kinds of things about our shared past, it was a long time ago. God, a decade more. Yeah, a
Did you
little.
actually make it up to Toronto for any of those, or were you local elsewhere?
I was local elsewhere, but I was in all of the for the chat and everyone else watching. We had a nice long chat about our shared history that we just didn't realize had happened. I had a lot of friends in Toronto and a lot of friends in other places. You've met a few of them on stream here. The James was also around way back when, and it's one of those surprising small world moments. When I had originally talked to my wife about bringing James on because they worked together on a project, I had no idea that we had this shared history. And so James is working here local in Malden with a group of people that are named Malden Neighbors Helping Neighbors. And I first got involved with it when my wife and James, I guess, started talking about it. And I was asked to get a website up and got an initial site up, just like a small enough build that my wife and then James and others have worked on. And, I'm going to be real honest with chat here before. I had never heard this term mutual aid or known really what it entailed until they started talking about it. And I was, of course, around for the early chats before they ran off to do all of this work while I tried to keep the lights on in our house. And it's been crazy watching because I get to see it from our side, my family's side, where Anna goes out a few times a week to work on this for hours on end. And it's a really interesting topic that I thought we should talk about more. So first off, I would love you to kind of describe to the audience what is mutual aid.
Yeah,
It's a big term, but what is mutual aid?
it is a big term. And if you Google what is mutual aid, right, you're going to get a bunch of different answers. And the search results have been sort of poisoned a little bit by COVID, right? Because there was this huge spike in searches for it after it got clear that things were going to be really bad. But mutual aid is practice. So it's something you actually do for people, but it's also an ideology because it also entails why you're doing those things for people. And it's a form of helping others that's grounded in your ideology, your politics. That's where the mutual and mutual aid comes from, of supporting each other so that together you can both prosper. So it's a little different from charity, which is the point that it's usually contrasted with, right? Um, we're getting to the holiday season. There's going to be a Salvation Army, like bell ringers around and everything.
Mm-hmm.
That's very much not mutual aid. That's a charity program. And the difference here is that when I give my money to Salvation Army, which I would never do, by the way, just
Either would I. Yeah.
um, when someone does that, they give the money and they walk away. So they don't have any control over where that money goes. They're not really following it. They don't build any relationship with the recipient of that money or with the organization itself. So charity is very one directional. And we can also contrast this with philanthropy, which is essentially charity for rich people with tax benefits, if you take a very cynical view of it. In both cases, you're not really seeing the people you're helping as an equal, and you're really doing it for, in some sense, your own sense of feeling good rather than a commitment to actually fix some of these problems. So the charity model can help people. It's not totally pointless, but it's not actually going to fix underlying problems in most cases. And in fact, it can sometimes make things worse if the only source of aid that someone is getting is charity. So like someone just zooms in with some money and buys them some food, does something for them, and then leaves, right? You get in this back and forth cycle. You don't have any chance to actually understand what caused the situation where the person needed help. Um, so it can get you to this place of like seemingly endless fundraisers and having to get more and more donors, spending more and more time hunting for those donors. And you give a couple decades of doing that, and you wind up with those kinds of nonprofits that are spending like 75% of their incoming money on fundraising to get more money, or on staff, or on other budgets like that, rather than actually helping people, the thing that their mission was supposed to be around. It's like a very slow corrosion.
Yep.
So mutual aid attempts to try and bypass that by building more authentic linkages between members of a community. So you're going to help people, and you're still going to donate money, you're still going to donate time, but you try and have a back and forth relationship. You don't assume that someone is helpless. You don't assume that they would be screwed if you didn't help them. You actually have a conversation with them. You try and figure out what are the things that they actually need, what things can you provide to them, but also what can they offer you? And that could be the experiences that they have, the knowledge of whatever crisis situation they're facing. You know, if someone is poor, they may actually know a lot more than you about what foods they need, their own medical conditions, how to work with government programs. So you just giving them money might help them for a day. But if you have a back and forth and have that be a mutual learning experience, you can help them on an ongoing basis and give them stability. And they can help you understand how they got into that situation and what sorts of systematic changes you might need to enact to prevent that happening to other people. So that's a really long-winded answer.
It is. You touched on a bunch of things there. And for all the people just showing up in chat there, I want to say, you know, we're talking about mutual aid here with James. And you touched on one issue that's always been very important to me when it comes to charity specifically, and that's the efficiency score of a charity. You know, there are very few charities that I think should ever run less than 80% efficient if they're going to be deserving of anyone's money. The only one that really comes to mind that I'm like, I understand why you're so bad off on your score is like the Red Cross, because there's not much they're going to be able to do about that hospital ship's costs. A hospital ship is expensive. But, you know, for everyone else pretty much, you know, I sit there and I always go to up to websites and I check their star ratings, their efficiency scores, and everything else before I ever work with a charity. Because if 70% of your money is going to pay for the mortgage on the guy who runs the charity's house, you're not getting any help from me. It's not really ever been about money for me because I've never had any. I don't really do a good job of collecting it. But you know, over on the mutual aid front, you don't really have that issue because it looks like, you know, it's a back and forth interaction like you said. But the people who you're helping, if you give them enough room with your help, can also help you. And that's the key that's been interesting that I've been watching, because it would seem that, you know, it's more important to help people get back on their feet in a way where they're also contributing to help others. And that's what I've been witnessing you guys doing. And I would love to kind of explain what some of this work is to people. Like, I know there's everything from food assistance to rent assistance to just medical assistance to driving places to anything kind of you really need to do to survive during the day. But like, what's the list of stuff you do and what does it entail? Because I know there's even like, there was City Space and now there's a private business that's housing some, like, how does this structurally work? How do you pull this off?
Well, it might make sense to talk a little bit about how we formed, and I think some of that will flow naturally from that answer.
Yeah.
So, you know, you take America, and you specifically take Massachusetts, right? We have this reputation of being a wealthy country, and we're a blue state and a wealthy state. So a lot of people make this assumption that poverty isn't a big deal here, that, you know, maybe there's a few poor people, a few homeless people, and you just have to give to charity to help them out, get them back on their feet. But what we really have is like more something akin to a caste system in the United States, right? Like you have people who may not even know anyone who's from an upper tier of wealth in our society. So it can be really easy to get a misleading picture of how things are in your state or really even in your own community, right? Like how many of your neighbors do you actually talk to? when I bought here in Malden, we sent about 50 letters to our neighbors in the community and didn't get a single reply, right? That's how disconnected American culture is from each other now. So that's the situation before COVID. And then COVID starts to hit. We start getting really concerning updates in February. I know the initial updates were maybe as soon as like December or January, but February is when I started noticing we're not really doing any of the things that we need to if we want this not to be a pandemic. And if this is going to be a pandemic, it's going to kill more than 1 million people if we just let it go its course. 1 million people in the United States specifically. So in early March, when I got back from a trip and saw that we still didn't have a lockdown, that we still didn't have any organizations preparing for this at the state level, that's when I really decided that I couldn't just wait around for the government to do something. It was clear that the response that they were taking was going to exacerbate this a great deal. So I started flyering locally in my neighborhood with some up-to-date COVID info, so like a Google Doc printed up that you could go and see, well, what orders had been issued, what was the current CDC guidance. And it's easy to forget, it's been so long now, but we didn't even really know how this spread or how bad it was going to be. So through that flyering effort, if you've ever done political flyering before, you know that like putting up flyers in your neighborhood and getting 20 or 30 responses that day is an unheard of response rate. I've never even
That's
heard
crazy.
of that before.
I'd be happy with 2. I'd be happy with 1 on the same day. That's crazy.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, word spread fast, and I got connected with a family actually that had started a Facebook group for something similar for sharing information and connecting folks. And we actually merged our efforts together, so that was kind of cool. So 2 people independently in Malden had started this thing, and we pulled it together. We had some good meetings about what kinds of work we wanted to do, how we wanted to help people. And we started figuring out who our membership was going to be. So we had folks coming in pretty much exclusively from Malden, but from all different walks of life. Though one thing that was really interesting is, for those on the stream, you may not know Malden at all. It's a city in Massachusetts near Boston, and it's got a reputation for being a little more insular, right? Like people have lived in Malden 30 years, and if you just show up, you're kind of a nobody. But a lot of our organizers are actually folks who have only been here less than 5 years. I've only lived in the city for about 2 years myself. And a lot of us also lean younger than the city on average. So we started getting together and we started looking at what we thought we would need to do. And the biggest one at first was just getting information out there. Because if you look in early March, there were very few cases in the United States at all. And basically none in Boston until the Biogen outbreak, which is when things really started to go off the charts here. So we started off with that information, but we did a really big investment in initial logistics. We used what we called a neighborhood point person system. This is based on some really awesome work coming out of the mutual aid and restorative justice communities about building stronger neighborhoods, where you essentially have like a coordinator for your neighborhood who's responsible for keeping track of what's happening in that immediate vicinity. So we set up one of those for each ward in Malden. So we had that cluster of people doing that work. And we set up a really good system for triaging requests. And because several of us are coming from tech jobs, we are familiar with information systems. So it runs a little closer to something like a startup might run. So we're using Google Drive, we're using Trello, we have email-based systems. Thank you, Gregg, for doing WordPress, so I don't have to do WordPress.
Yes. We also have Zapier for integrations, so the Google Docs and the Trello are integrated. All kinds of fun stuff.
Yeah, so we got this system in place like sort of before we actually saw the spike in demand. But it was clear, even in the really early days, that there was going to be a spike. It just wasn't clear how bad it was going to get or what exactly would be needed. And I think one thing I was caught off guard by is I didn't expect the Trump administration or the Baker administration in Massachusetts to do well, but they really mishandled this. Like they couldn't even get PPE to hospitals, never mind actually helping people with unemployment or anything like that. So that first month or two was just really hectic, trying to scrounge up whatever resources we could. Now I don't drive myself. I remember the senior care facility up the street from me, they were basically out of cleaning supplies. And I went and walked down to actually the local distillery. So if you're ever in Everett, Massachusetts, go to Short Path Distillery. they gave me two huge jugs of hand sanitizer that they had made using their brewing or their distilling situation. And I actually walked it back to my house carrying like, several gallons of hand sanitizer for about 20 minutes. Now that's what it was in the beginning, right? And in that beginning phase, everyone's panicking, but there's not actually that much COVID in the community yet. So it's still pretty safe. It's not actually that different than it was before. It's just people are much more concerned about what's going to come next. And from then on, we started to see what we knew the real demand would be. That's people who are sick and have to isolate. It's people who aren't sick, but are really vulnerable, so they can no longer go to the grocery store safely because they're worried about getting infected. So we have this triaging system where each of these neighborhood pods gets requests that come in, and we actually have a conversation with these people. We call them up on the phone, we talk with them. There's no eligibility requirements other than that you live in Malden, and even then, if you don't live in Malden, we'll still help you find someone who can help you.
A lot of the other cities around us have groups running too.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. What is it? There's a big Medford group. So there's a lot of groups around us that we can refer people to.
Yeah. Mamas is the group in Medford and Somerville. And they actually have been recognized like nationally and even internationally for the scale of the work that they're doing. So really cool stuff happening over there and certainly very inspiring to learn about. For the record, around this time is also when all the regional mutual aid groups started hopping together on a Zoom call to discuss strategies, to discuss things that we were seeing in the community. So it's a very horizontal movement. There's a lot of autonomy in how you run your group. You can do it whatever way you like. Some groups have lead organizers, other groups don't. Some groups are working really closely with the city. Some groups are totally disconnected from anything political. So it's kind of all over the place, and we share all sorts of advice over this period. But yeah, over that summer period, we're really doing what we can to get people to stay home, to help people with whatever their living situation is. And it's really all over the place. We're not just delivering food, we're also delivering cleaning supplies. We're helping people get their trash get taken away from their house. We help people if they have a broken down car and they need a cheap repair. We have some petty cash. Maybe we can help them with that. Things to get people back on their feet and ideally get them to a place where they can help others out, help their own family, or come back and help Malden neighbors as a group.
I remember there being one that stuck out to me was a woman who ended up, coming in needing food first, but then over the phone call, which was the best part that I heard, you guys found out that, there's multiple kids living in this house. They're down to one bed. There's not much food coming in. There's not much money coming in. Rent's about to be a problem. And as I understood it, some furniture was located and some moving help was done. And like it wasn't just food that showed up. Like the amount of effort that was put in for this person was large.
Yeah. And if I'm remembering that case in particular, I think it was the Muslim Aid Society was the group who helped us with that, which was really awesome. That we, when you're moving someone during COVID, right, that's like one of the least safe things you can do. You have to go in someone's house. You're moving around, so you're breathing a lot. You have to be there for a while. You have to be there lifting with someone. So it's dangerous. And they actually helped us find like pods of volunteers who had the same COVID status. They were like isolating together and helped us do some of this. As well as some of our organizers in Malden Neighbors have also formed closed pods so that they can work together on group projects like this. So yeah, we actually take safety really seriously there. We worked, Mamas did a lot of this as well, on having protocols, like how do you even deliver food safely to an immunocompromised person during COVID? This was before we knew anything about how it was really spread, so we had to assume it could be surfaces, it could be airborne, sanitize your vehicle, sanitize the pickup, sanitize yourself. So there was a lot of work in that era.
So, thanks for the sub there, Dev Null, the gift, that was great. And I will show a screenshot of exactly what came up on my screen because it's hilarious. I'm just not going to do it midstream here, but maybe I'll tweet it out or something. Wow. One of the things that hasn't really been covered here is, you guys aren't a true organization in the sense of a governmental, license in any way. You aren't a corporation. You aren't a nonprofit. You don't, truly exist other than the idea of you existing, right?
Do
And
any of us really exist?
well, sure. I mean, we could get in. I mean, maybe you come back for a nice existential episode, but there's no actual nonprofit here, and you guys are doing this just out of the kindness of your own hearts. I mean, the amount of effort that's being put in is just to help. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of show people is how you're accomplishing some of this, because with these people calling in, these people using the form on the website that ends up going through that whole tech stack through Google and Zapier and Trello and everything else, you end up with someone on the phone who's, you're not just taking their initial response, which was, I need to eat tomorrow. You're actually calling and trying to say, well, why do you need to eat tomorrow and need us? Which is a much more important question than what would you like to eat? What can we do to help the root of the problem? There's this whole thing, people asking that wonderfully stupid question, or saying, don't give a man a fish, teach him to fish. Well, how about give a man a fish and then teach him to fish? Like, you can do both. It's not exclusive. Like,
Yeah.
But so you're kind of working on both, right? But you aren't a nonprofit. You aren't incorporated. You don't have like central offices. You have donated space here and there. So how do you operate in a way where you are providing food? Where does the food come from?
Well, let me first talk a little about why we made that choice.
Yeah.
There are some mutual aid groups that are incorporated 501c3s. It's definitely possible, but that format, it implies some constraints, right? You have to have a board, you have to do financial reports, you have to spend money on incorporation.
Overhead.
And it takes a lot of time. Yeah. And that overhead matters in terms of time, but it also has some subtle effects on the structure of the group, right? Like having a board of directors is a very hierarchical sort of thing. And granted, I'm the only like more hardcore anarchist person in the group, but I think there's something to be said for, in this type of group, having a horizontal structure, because we're all volunteers. We could get replaced at any time. And when I say replaced, I mean we have to drop out because we get sick with COVID. In my case, I got furloughed because of COVID, so I lost my job. And I had to actually do full-time job hunting. So I had to just drop off the map for like a month or two. Yeah, so that's why we made that choice. But that's not to say that we don't trust any 501c3, right? We can be pretty responsive to the conditions on the ground. So we work with a lot of local food pantries or existing organizations that have been around for decades and decades. They have the supply chains in place. They have the logistics to be able to distribute warm meals, canned goods. So we really respect the work that they do. But at the same time, they're inherently limited because they have a single mission as a nonprofit. Mm-hmm. And yes, they can maybe sign on to a petition, but they can't, in the same way that we can, just hand someone $20 because $20 is the barrier to them getting their ID or paying their cell phone bill. Giving someone $20 of canned food will help them, but sometimes they actually just need the cash, or they need some help that's way more specific. We see that happen with the housing groups in the city as well, right? So they maybe can help you get thousands of dollars of federally derived housing funding, and we're going to help you through that process. But what if the blocker to the process is you don't have internet access to check your email, because it all has to be done over email now? So that $50 of not having an internet bill for the month is a blocker to you getting $4,000 of aid. And we actually know people who have been held up like this, where the aid doesn't come in and they get an eviction filed against them. Even if they pay off the back rent, there's no guarantee the landlord is going to stop that eviction process. So being agile like that, having a structural ability to be agile is actually really important. And I'd say even more important than the general term of overhead for a nonprofit. It really has more to do with the mission and why we're doing the work that we're doing. So constraining ourselves, it really does tie your hands to have a single mission statement, to have a single corporate structure. We can respond to a lot more than a lot of those groups can.
And so now we're on the ground. We have you guys building these lists, calling these people, finding out what people need, and you need somewhere to put the stuff you're bringing in, and you need someone to give you the stuff that you're bringing in. So first off, as I understand it, local government was involved, and then for reasons, you're now somewhere else. And how did that start out? How did local government actually get involved in a way where you ended up with space?
Yeah. So when people say local government, there tends to be a monolithic view to that, right? It's just the local government.
Right.
When in reality, there are individual counselors, there are individual employees, and the story of how we work with the city is really a story of individuals like that. We were very lucky to have a sponsor in the city who really saw the work that we had already been doing and realized that our lack of a physical headquarters was actually hurting our ability to help the community. So the city had a building that's a community center that was totally shut down apart from cleaning. So like only a handful of staff coming in there. And this building had all sorts of space. It even has like cooking stations, tons of utility for that kind of emergency. But the city didn't actually have anyone who could use it in that state. Like the city was not equipped to have emergency staff doing distributions. So the manager of this facility essentially allowed us to use it under very strict guidelines. So we had to comply with certain times that we could be there. We had to limit the number of people who were there. We had to do quarantining procedures for drop-offs. Drop-offs had to take place externally to the building, and we had to bring them in. So in a lot of ways, we were actually taking more safety procedures than a lot of government officials were at that time period. So that's how the story of how we get this building, right, is one really strong advocate who believes in what we're doing, who is willing to take some heat for it, really allowed us to do months of deliveries out of there, which was truly awesome. And the generosity of the community really, I can't state that enough. You would have people just show up being like, yeah, I cleaned my closet and I found 195 masks. Can you take those? Like, yes, absolutely.
Yes.
We can take those. They'll go right to a hospital. They'll go to a senior center. You'd have churches delivering food. You'd have individuals who, there are some people who are pretty well known in our community who just made very large number anonymous donations because, maybe they're a city official or something, but they just don't want their name associated with it. So they're happy to do it anonymously. So there was this great outpouring of support, but we're not there anymore. And that's not because we had a specific falling out with the city. We do still work with a lot of folks in the city on a regular basis. It really comes down to what happened over the summer. And the answer is a lot of people got complacent. They thought that this was as bad as it was going to get. They thought that COVID was over. They thought that kids were just going to go back to school and things were going to be normal. So they actually started using that building again for, I think, teen programming. So there were more people coming in and out of the building. And we judged that it wasn't safe anymore to do quarantine and isolation of goods when you had random people walking through that building. So again, we take safety very seriously here.
Yeah.
And this is where we started reaching out into alternatives. So we looked at the options of, do we use an organizer's house? Do we rent a building temporarily? I know some folks have actually done that for previous mutual aid work. But we got a really amazing opportunity. There's a local Kung Fu studio, and they're really, really great people who run this. They're actually activists. And even though they could be in business, they've decided not to be for COVID safety reasons. They think it's the ethical thing to do. So they were out of business, and they have this building that is essentially just open space because it's a martial arts studio, right? And they actually allowed us to do food distributions out of there. Again, still adhering to a lot of safety guidelines. So because it's indoors, we try to only have 1 or 2 people in there at a time. We don't allow external guests. But it's really a case where a local business owner is the one who provides something worth so much to the community, the ability for us to do distributions. And when I say distributions, right, what does that actually look like? So I started doing shifts there again just recently, actually, because I usually do more of the fundraising and back-end organization and strategic stuff. But it's really good to keep your hands on the day-to-day work because you can kind of lose touch if you're not actually the person lifting grocery bags or calling people.
Right.
So on a day like that, we might have 4 volunteers come in. Each of those volunteers might have 4 to 6 assigned families that they're delivering food to. And those families can be anywhere from 1 elder living by themselves to 2 parents and 6 kids. And each one of those families has a list of goods they need for that week. That list of goods has been compiled by our neighborhood point people. So they have this process where they do calls with people on a regular basis. They check if their needs have changed. So, someone might sign up for us initially because their whole family is sick with COVID. They need cleaning supplies, they need food delivery. And then afterwards, they're better from COVID, but they lost their job because they were sick. So they still need food on an ongoing basis. So what's in the deliveries changes all the time. But we'll go.
That's part of the agility, which is really great.
Yeah, definitely. This is not something where we use a heavyweight case management system. There's no paperwork. You don't have to show forms of ID.
Right.
You are asked to make sure these are real Malden people in need. Because unfortunately, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, there's a lot of scamming in this space. But yeah, it's especially working with folks who are undocumented, right? Like you just cannot go tell people, we can't help you unless you can give us 3 forms of ID. And I've actually heard that was happening with turkeys this year, that you had to show your identification card to get a turkey. So you can't celebrate
wow.
Thanksgiving if you don't have your passport or whatever. Which I think is silly, right? Like, yeah. How much is a frozen turkey? And you're really going to gate that, like someone in need on. People lose their licenses all the time. We see this huge barrier where even the nominal fee of like $25 to replace it, and then going all day to go out of your way to the RMV during COVID, they just can't do it. And that blocks them from pretty much any state aid out there.
The people who handle those kind of rules and those kind of changes to rules don't understand poverty finance. They don't get that they don't see the fallback of not having one being related to that $25. They see it as some failing on your part. And then they don't see that $25 was needed so you could eat yesterday, and and your kids could have toilet paper and paper towels, whatever. But like they don't understand poverty finance and how now you don't have that $20 to do the future thing, which is having your ID, because you had more relevant current interests with it. They just don't get it when they're making those rules. But like the structure of this, as I kind of understand it now, which I understand it a lot better after the conversation here, is mutual aid comes from the local citizenry. Everyone in town needs to start thinking about how to help their neighbors, and in hopes get help from their neighbors too. It's got to be a two-way street. And in doing this, you end up with a group of volunteers like yourself and my wife and everyone else who's involved with our group, Malden Neighbors Helping Neighbors, here in our town, and putting these things together isn't as complicated as I initially thought when I first heard the term and what you guys were going to be doing. Sure, we have some tech, but every little city like ours has someone who can handle a little tech, and will volunteer. You'd be surprised. We're not hard to find. And if anyone ever sees this video and wants to set up a mutual aid group and just needs a little tech help, please reach out. I'm happy. I will host your website. I don't care. For free. Let's go. But, that's the kind of spirit we need to do mutual aid. And here locally, there were a bunch of nonprofits, because of the type of area we live in, already dealing with some things, like Bread of Life is one that comes to mind, that I think you guys have worked with a little, or a lot. I'm not actually sure. But, so tying into that local infrastructure is also important, whether just to make sure you're not stepping on each other's toes or how much help you can offer each other. But in the end, it was about getting space. It was about getting people to drive. It was about building out kind of an architecture of how you're going to do this for safety reasons. It was, all these little things, but none of it's actually complicated. And even how you described the city side of it, talking to your local counselors, talking to your local emissaries. I mean, our city has a few people who weren't in like any specific city office, but were definitely the go-between between the hires up in our local government. And everyone knew that if you talked to these two people, everyone who needed to hear it would hear it, right? And everyone in town knows those people. If you don't know who that person is in your town, ask literally anyone on the street. They will tell you their name. Like, it's just, these people are well known in these towns. And whether they get things done or not is a whole other question. Who knows? Ours, was helpful. Then initial talks with the city went well. Here's some space. When that ended up not being right, I think it's brilliant that you've ended up in a martial arts studio that isn't running because of safety reasons. But that leads to the next kind of interesting tidbit we take from this, that if you need space, look for the types of businesses that might have a strong enough foundation to hold on to their building right now, but no reason to have it open at this point. Those are perfect candidates for you to be able to stage mutual aid out of your hometown in. So like we've picked up a lot here, but when you talk about the food side of things, you talked about some money coming in. You talked about some food being dropped off, but I've heard of things like grocery runs. I've heard of interactions with food-related nonprofits and food pantries. You know, you guys end up on a daily basis with drivers who show up to the location that you're at, where your stuff is staged, and they get a list of, here's the people you're delivering to today, and here's the bags for them. And it's full of food that's already pre-sorted. It's their stuff in it, and all that material comes from multiple sources. So when you say volunteers, you're talking about people who are taking time out of their own lives, who have, you know, lucky enough the time to give, and they show up in the mornings and they put these bags together. They organize the drivers going to the right houses. Like, I mean, that's also not that complicated. A list has been made for what this person needs by someone else on the phone. Here's a bag. Here's a bunch of stuff. Someone else is worried about delivering the food to you, be it from a food pantry, a nonprofit like Bread of Life, or using the money donations to go to the grocery store to fill in gaps. Or, of course, local community dropping stuff off. And then people show up, and they sort this stuff into bags. The drivers show up. And there's other people who can't show up for any given reason. They just, it's not a thing. Their health is too compromised to be able to put themselves into these situations, or they don't drive and they're all the way at the other end of the city, whatever it is. Those people work on coordinating. They're the ones who make sure there are drivers available that day and stuff like that, right? But again, I haven't said anything complicated yet. Like, this is all relatively simple to get in place. It's really interesting to me. Now I have all kinds of questions still. I mean, questions about the viability long term. We aren't getting out of this anytime soon, I don't believe. And I would love to hear what you think about that. Like, is this organization stable enough that, you know, you guys expect to still be here in a year? Or honestly, because mutual aid is sort of always needed, or do you have no plans to shut this down? Is this just kind of how it is from now on? Like, how does the go forward look for you guys?
So just for a little context, right? I'd done activism prior to this, and some of that activism involved directly trying to help people. But I'd kind of avoided mutual aid as a space because a lot of my exposure to mutual aid was coming through the way that certain people in the queer community do it. Where a lot of the definition of mutual aid actually really starts to resemble charity again, where you try and make the ask for help so unqualified. This person is in need, just give them money, don't ask any questions. It was actually rife with scamming, and it wasn't really helping people get out of situations to the degree that I wanted to see that happen. So it's similar to what you mentioned about, you know, you look for charities that, like the effective altruism movement, right? Like looking for ones that are efficient along certain scores. I don't necessarily believe that that's the only way to evaluate it, but I do think we should evaluate whether our money and time is having an impact. But during COVID, I dived into it, even though this was something that I didn't feel was actually very sustainable in the current model that a lot of people were using. And that's why we spent a lot of time talking about values, talking about what kinds of work we did or didn't plan to do. As an example, we work with a lot of people who are facing evictions, and there's a lot of strategies there. And we don't address everything related to evictions. We don't try to be lawyers. We don't try and negotiate with the landlord. Those are all totally valid strategies, but we have to pick and choose because there's only so many hours in the day. So we have to admit what we can't do as well as what we can. Or we have limits on how much we try and send to a particular household on a monthly basis, not because we feel that that household doesn't deserve more than that, but just because we're so limited in the amount of cash flow that we have to make some really hard choices. And documenting that ahead of time means people aren't pressured on the spot to make a decision about whether someone is worthwhile or not.
Yep.
The reality is everyone's worthwhile, right? We just can't help everyone with our current finances. So that's a long-winded way to go back to where we were about maybe April, when the really urgent, like, get this thing started, get mailing lists set up, get a website set up. when that stuff had started to die back a little bit, and we started to talk about why we're doing this, how long we expect to do this. And I always came into this telling people we're going to be doing this for more than a year, and we should be prepared to keep doing it after there's a vaccine, because the economic distortions alone, the amount of people who are going to be put in poverty because of this is going to be astronomical. It's going to be like another Great Depression. And I think that everyone in the organization was totally on board with that. You know, it's a little scary hearing that, because you have to go back to March when you're first hearing about coronavirus, and we don't even know whether it's transmitted on surfaces, whether bleach is going to be enough. And then someone saying, yeah, but think about what it's going to be like a year from now when no one has a job. It's a little bit of an abstract concern, and it's depressing to talk about. But we did take the time to talk about it. And that's why we made that long-term investment. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of other mutual aid groups in the area didn't make that same degree of investment. So some of them have actually had to scale back operations already. I've heard multiple cases of a mutual aid group just shutting down operations or scaling back operations, so they don't do any more deliveries or grocery drop-offs or anything like that. They just run a Facebook group where people can post about what they need or what they're looking for. And those Facebook groups, they can really get filled with scammers, with spammers. So they're not very effective at actually helping people. So during the summer, I think, was where we started to see some of that die off happening. We've been pushing pretty hard to get people to recognize the severity of all of this. And again, during the summer is when that started to die off too. We fought really hard to get anyone to take this seriously in March. Then they finally saw some deaths and were like, oh shit, this is real. And as soon as that peak of deaths went away, people assumed that it wasn't going to come back, that it was going to be over, there wasn't going to be a second peak. But we had always been preparing for that. So maybe about 2 months or so ago, 2 or 3 months, I actually wrote up a document about what can we expect over the next 6 months for mutual aid. And I'm actually really happy it did not turn out as bad as I thought it might have, or at least hasn't so far with the Trump administration. So there's, of course, the outcome of the election, but also the fact that there was really minimal political violence, which was not a given this year. It was really worrying, because if you look at the people who are most involved in these mutual aid networks, right, they're activists, they're queer people. If there's any kind of civil disruption like that, they're going to be in the streets, and they're also going to be targeted for this. So it was a very real concern. And we actually did see a dip about the week of the election, where people were just at so many actions, they didn't have time for the mutual aid meetings. So yeah, it is a really explicitly leftist project in some ways. And that's not the ideology of everyone taking part. You know, we have a lot of people who are there just because they want to help their neighbors, and they maybe don't, they wouldn't say like, oh, I'm an anarchist. They wouldn't say, oh, I believe in the concepts behind mutual aid. But they're showing up and trying to help people in the way that they know. And I think there's some real value in that. But yeah, this planning document, right? If I look at the issues that we're facing, yeah, there's going to be a second peak. We're into that. It's worse than it's ever been right now. But that's not even everything that we're going to have to face. We're going to be facing record unemployment. We're going to be facing school closures. So all those kids are going to need more food because there's not going to be meals, or they have to get remote pickups of meals. They're going to need help with education. That was actually something we did in Malden, was helping deliver Chromebooks to every student in Malden at the schools here. And we live in New England, right? If we're lucky, it'll be a good winter. And if we're not lucky, what do you do if someone loses heat in the middle of winter and doesn't have money because they lost their job for COVID? Their landlord is supposed to send someone over to repair it. How do you actually make sure the landlord does that? Because we have seen in Malden already, so this isn't just an abstract. I know specific families this has happened to, where the heat hasn't been repaired, where the cooling doesn't work, where the refrigerator is broken, and the landlord just doesn't do anything. So being able to pressure on a lot of different fronts, and especially to prepare, not knowing what the worst fire is going to be in a few months. Yep. So you sort of have to get people's imagination fired up. Like, yeah, it can be a little bit doom and gloom, but you have to think that way to understand what you might be facing. And the real challenge is, how do you think like that on a long-term basis about some really depressing topics, but then still keep showing up for the people who need to be fed every day, for the deliveries that need to go out every day. And I think we've found a good balance for that. There is some depressing conversation. There's been some tears. But we've also hung out as friends. And a lot of these folks, I never would have met them in Malden if it hadn't been for this. We actually just went out on a hike to the tallest point in Malden earlier, because it might be our last chance to do that before the COVID numbers and the weather make it just untenable to really have any social activities.
And I will say that they did it completely safely. My wife went on that hike, and there were masks, there was distancing, there was all the stuff they needed to do. One of the things that you've just touched on that is really key is burnout. With the amount of stuff for the last few weeks that all of us activist types have had to do, a lot of them who were involved with mutual aid didn't have time for the mutual aid side of things. And I can understand to some extent, prioritizing the democracy and safety of people in our country on the political side of things over some mutual aid for a few weeks, especially if you had been doing it for months and months and months, right? But I definitely hope that a lot of those people don't end up burning themselves out through these next couple months of fights before January and confirmation and all the other fun stuff, and everyone pays some attention here, because burnout is important. And for anyone who's listening to this who might actually be thinking about starting their own mutual aid setup, I would say that one of the keys you've got to do is find enough people to distribute the load. The thing that I have seen in every major activism circle I've ever been in is the 30 people and then the 2 who get 80% of the work done, and then one of them is just insane, so they just stay around the whole time. That person's never going anywhere. But the other one doing that other half of the big piece of work gets burned out and disappears, and suddenly everything crumbles. Distribute the work. So if someone even tries to do that much work, talk to them about it. Make sure it's clear that you see them burning themselves out. It's so important on our side to notice the mental health aspects of the people who are actually doing this work, because it is draining. The depression will set in on the 100th family that you're having to help feed when you're also struggling to feed yourself, And we've had our financial issues here at my household pretty badly during the pandemic here. We had been building up some tooling and some other stuff just on a personal level as a business for small businesses to support local in-person stuff, and it was supposed to start going live around end of March, end of April, and that time frame was where we were aiming. And then our own little city kind of became the hotbed, the place that COVID hit Massachusetts. As James had said earlier, there was this conference here in Massachusetts, the Biogen conference, and it's a standard conference. Everyone has conferences all the time, and they take a building downtown, but someone came to that conference with COVID, and here in Massachusetts, we had 2 people who went to that conference and got it and came right back home. And before we had any other reported cases known in the state publicly, Malden has 2, has 4, has 8, and we're the first giant red city here with a major problem in Massachusetts, right in our little hometown where James and everyone started this mutual aid group, and it was absolutely crazy. And then seeing people decide that it was over during the summer while we were still the hotbed. When every other city had gone back down to yellow, or even maybe weren't even on the color scale anymore, we were still high yellow, red, high yellow, every other day, we were still up there. We never really got a break from it. And I saw from that a lot of people burning out. I saw a lot of people trying to help and then just not being able to deal with it themselves. So the one thing that is really important here with this type of work is that you watch your own mental health, and not only watch it, but when you feel yourself starting to burn out, don't feel bad about it. Don't let the depression hit you that you're not as good as these other people who seem to be able to do this work without burning out, right? Talk to them specifically. Find the ones that are still going strong. They probably aren't. They're probably in the same position as you and just not saying it, just like you. These conversations are important, and they will help you through doing this type of work, because it is a large load mentally, physically, emotionally. It's gonna hit you. And the longer you do it, like one of these, where James and everyone are having to do this for, God, I mean, at least another year, if not more. It's just going to continue to weigh on you. So make sure to watch yourself through this. Make sure that when you're helping others, you are also not hurting yourself. And make sure that the people around you know when you're starting to feel it, because everyone around you is also helping others, and you're an other. They will want to help you. It's important. That's, I think, one of the most important things to keeping something like this going strong for a long time is people feeling comfortable having those parts of the conversation with themselves and internally.
Yeah. I think one thing that doesn't get talked about often enough is the huge mental health strain that people are under right now. Just from being cooped up alone or from being terrified they're going to get sick. And then you look at in the American psyche how tightly being a provider, having a job is coupled to your social life, to your identity within your family. So I'll be honest, like there's some really scary stuff happening out there. When we get a request come in, we have to think, are there signs of abuse happening in this household? Has this person expressed that they've been having suicidal ideations? Are they saying that they're depressed? When was the last time they left the house? And that stuff is incredibly traumatic to have to face as a volunteer. So I think there's this expectation that some people get into this thinking like, oh yeah, I can deliver some food and I can help people out. And yeah, that is the majority of what we do. But in terms of level of stressfulness, like you said, the food delivery on some sense is simple, right? Like unless something goes wrong, it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
But what do you do when you have someone who had mental health struggles before COVID? Like you're not going to fix that by delivering some food. And even the concept of trying to fix that person may not be what they want or what they feel they're capable of. But you can learn to see that person as a neighbor who needs help, who needs company, and to understand that while it might be stressful for you to have that experience of trying to help them and maybe even failing, right? Because that's the other side of doing mutual aid during a pandemic. There's a very real chance that we will help someone and they will die anyways, you know? Like we may deliver groceries to a COVID household and then get the call next week, I'm sorry, they passed. We work directly with the contact tracing collaborative here in Massachusetts. So we get very sick people referred to us. And there's no way to prepare for that, right? Like having someone you tried your best to help die anyways is not something that you can take a Zoom training on and be okay with it. You just have to accept that it may make people leave the organization. You may have your own members be traumatized by the experiences that they have. And that's why I think it's so important to push for really structural changes, that we can never fix these issues by showing up after someone has COVID, after someone has suicidal ideation, after someone's pantry is running low.
Yeah, what you're doing is patching. You are solving immediate issues right now in the hopes that it will lead to better change for that person, but no systemic level changes are being solved by mutual aid.
I wouldn't quite go that far. I'd say that mutual aid actually just has to incorporate those systemic changes. That if what you're doing with mutual aid is focused entirely on helping people survive the day-to-day, but isn't building the power to address those structural changes, then you really have to question, like, how is that actually mutual aid, right? Because the importance of building a strong and resilient community is that you can take power back and have more self-governance. Being able to make decisions for your community on your community's behalf to strengthen it. And I think people aren't really used to that framing, right? So many people came into this expecting that the government was going to fix it. That, well, okay, even if Trump was going to make a mess of things, that at least in Massachusetts, we have a strong government. And there's been almost no action at the State House in terms of relief. They're just kind of deciding that they're okay with there being hundreds of thousands of evictions in Massachusetts, even while the pandemic is still happening. So that's very core to us. We show up at political rallies. We've spoken on behalf of legislation. We've talked to the city council, stressing the importance that they need to speak to senators, to representatives, to keep pushing things upwards to the decision makers, and really show that there is demand for these changes, that the communities want it. That just because you're not hearing it from your constituents who have enough time to show up to city council meetings or to some Thanksgiving event to be a big influential donor, that really it's everyday people who need these changes. And that there's this huge unseen mass of people really, really struggling. They were struggling before COVID, and this has been like a sledgehammer. We know people in Malden who have already gotten evicted, even while the eviction moratorium was in place, so illegally evicted. We've seen landlords try and raise rent when they're not allowed to. We've seen them change locks when they're not allowed to. It's super illegal in Massachusetts, by the way, for the landlord to change the lock themselves like that. So we can't fix those problems, right? Not with just providing food, not with just providing some small amounts of cash. We need a government scale response to this problem. And if the government's not going to provide it, then we need to figure out how do we pressure them into doing it. We can't assume that we are going to take the place of the government. We have to use any leverage that we have against them and to understand how to make effective change. And that's why it's really important that we get to know each other on an individual basis as organizers. Because the lessons that we learn now in this crisis situation, I think anyone in this situation is going to naturally get radicalized, right? When you've seen your elected representatives literally have a vote on how many cannabis shops that Malden should have before they discuss any within Malden aid about COVID, I don't see how anyone can see like inside the sausage factory and not go vegan afterwards, right?
Right. That's the key here. That I was hoping you would touch on kind of the nature of the beast is you have to get your local politicians, which are much more accessible to you, to talk to the politicians above them and fire it just up the chain. One of the things that I would love to do here kind of at the end for viewers, James has to go here shortly. Another thing actually to do with the mutual aid group, meetings and all kinds of fun stuff. But I would love to touch on one more kind of subject related to the tech behind the group. For our type of audience here, they're going to kind of want to hear how this all works. And I think, for me, when people from the group first came to me with the idea of how we might connect up some of this technology, my first thought was during this type of a pandemic, I bet a lot of these tech companies are being pretty cool about pricing. And of course, I went and I reached out to Weglot. And they're a translation service that you can use on multiple types of websites, but on WordPress it's a plugin, and they normally have I'd say good pricing, but good pricing for a translation service, but which is usually expensive. I reached out to them and just said, look, we're starting a mutual aid group for COVID response here in our local city, and we need translations, and we're not going to have the money to pay for your product, but we need your product. And their response was literally 5 minutes later to give us a free pro account to the service. I then reached out to Zapier, who some of our tech-minded people will know exactly who they are, and some of the others won't. But Zapier kind of provide this glue that allow you to connect systems together. So on our website for Malden Mutual Aid here, for Malden Neighbors Helping Neighbors, at maldenneighbors.org, there's a Google form. And it's an intake form that allows people to just come in and say, look, I'm here in Malden and I now need help. And this talks to not only the tech stack, but the separation of concerns, which is important. People should be tasked with dealing with the thing that they're going to deal with and not understanding the whole, because it's overload. It's too much work to do. It's too much to take on your own shoulders. So separating out the tasks is important. And the way the tech stack works is you fill out this form and it goes into a Google spreadsheet, and then Zapier sees a new row go into the spreadsheet and says, I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it into a Trello board, specifically one, I'm going to create a new card for this person that the people who make phone calls can see. And all the people who make phone calls get a notification. And one of them hops on, takes this, makes the phone call. And then they take notes on that card about, what the phone call, how it went, what this person needs. And they move that over to one of the other boards where the next person who actually handles with now dealing with those needs comes in. And you can kind of see, the person who handles the website, the person who handles the phone calls, the people who handle the initial, now we're going to deal with those needs, it's all broken up. And the tech stack is really simple, but it's a form. It goes into a Google spreadsheet. Zapier takes that into a Trello board, which people have learned how to use. It's not that complicated. And then only the people who need to get notified by specific boards do get notified by it, keeping the separation of needs and concerns in place, which is very helpful for just people to focus on their tasks. And, this stuff it's not complicated. It's not hard to set up. There will be locals. If there aren't, reach out to us. I know there's multiple people here. Even in the chat, there's people who are offering, let me help. If anyone's out there watching this video and wants the help, reach out. We will be more than happy to point you at places. But I will also end on that type of a note with any company that you think you need their resources right now and you are going to be focused on this specifically, email them. I so far haven't gotten a no yet from any company I have emailed asking for support, for services, for an account to use for this purpose. Every one of them has said yes. So maybe I'm either just getting really lucky, but I don't think so. I'd love to ask, does the chat have any questions here for all this fun stuff? As you're talking to two guys with all kinds of DevOps specialties, and mentioning DevOps in the chat.
Yeah, I was actually hoping to get a chance to talk about that. So I actually am a DevOps person. I'm a principal infrastructure engineer.
Yep.
And I have done absolutely zero coding on this project. And there's a reason for that. The answer is that we need to have this work reliably for a team of 20 plus organizers, and we're onboarding new organizers all the time. I could make a mutual aid website of my own and script it in some language and build a really cool resource tracking app, and it would be useful to precisely me, right?
Right.
So if I look at the tool you described, being able to do automatic translations, that's amazing. And we get that for free because we built it on WordPress. And do I want to run a WordPress website? No. Do I
Not
have
really.
super high of it?
My personal
No.
website is a static website on Eleventy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I use Hugo for mine.
Yeah.
So I think there's a very real difference between what I, as a technologist, enjoy and prefer to use as tools versus what does the rest of the world like to use. And I think a lot of people can succumb to techno-solutionism, which is when you think, oh, I will solve mutual aid if I just build the best mutual aid app. And that's not really what it's about. That's not to say there's no place for technology. I think actually, if anyone's really interested in using your coding skills for a project like this, I would encourage you to reach out to Black Socialists of America. They're working on a really cool, what's called a dual power project. So mutual aid is adjacent to this. It's essentially any kind of project that both exists within a capitalist framework, but is also trying to be opposed to it. So things like cooperatives, which that's something I spend a lot of time on, is cooperatives. They've actually issued a call that they're looking for developers for these kinds of projects. But I think that kind of longer reaching activist project that has a good horizon for development is very different from mutual aid in a crisis situation where you need to get totally random people you've never met before onboarded onto your tools. And it's really nice when I do the account onboardings, all I have to do is log into Trello, push a button, log into Google, push a button. It's all very familiar stuff. And if I had to train someone to be the account administrator for that, I could probably just do that in an hour. There's no way I could take a random person and teach them the specifics of my Python script running on my Unix machine, right?
Yeah, you also run into the bus problem, of which, for people who don't know the wonderful development bus problem, it's that James there knows all that code, where it is, and is probably the only human with access to it, and gets hit by a bus, and now your mutual aid group is screwed. Never introduce a bus problem in a group like this. If it's your personal pet project for your website or something, bus problems are fine. This is not a case where that's a solution.
Yeah. Though it is also worth saying that a lot of these tools were not originally designed for these purposes. So I'll give one specific example. We created a new Gmail account, and that Gmail account was tied to a new Google Voice number because we wanted to have a hotline, because a lot of people don't use email. So that's a huge consideration, right? If you want to do mutual aid effectively, it cannot just be online. It's got to be on phones. It's got to be in posters. So we hooked up the Google Voice number, and it was all working well and good until one of our organizers sent a few too many emails from that Gmail account, which locked us permanently out of that Google account, that Gmail account, that Google Voice number. So we don't even know if we lost anything in that voicemail inbox. There might have been some people who needed help and we just can't get back to them. And it turned out that Google's account recovery process had some broken cycle in it. So we permanently lost access to that account. If we had had that account with our Google Drive as well, that could have been a disaster. So use these platforms, but remember that they're not your friends and they're offering this COVID help because it's free for them and it's good publicity. There's still a lot of ways in which the services that they're providing can actually really harm the work that you need to do. And that work also needs to really take into account security. And I'm a huge security fan myself. But you have to think about what the threat model is there. The threat model is not that someone like ransomwares your mutual aid group, right? You're just running in Google Drive. You don't really have to worry about that. The threat is that you leak private information, healthcare information, information about an undocumented person. You're really dealing with people's real lives here, and you have to treat that with the respect that it deserves. So definitely worth a note whenever you're thinking about technology. It's not just a matter of closing out tickets and building an efficient way to do that. It's really helping build a system that is responsible for helping someone else's life. So treat that with the respect that it deserves.
So let's let you get off to the meeting because we're running a little over what you had agreed to give us here tonight. And I would like to end on, besides watching this and getting a good understanding of how, Malden has done mutual aid and other suggestions like Black Socialist America and all the others, is there a centralized kind of a resource where someone has said, I know how to do mutual aid, here's a guide? Does that PDF exist, that wiki, that whatever?
Okay, so asking an anarchist for the centralized version of anything.
That's why I laughed when I said it.
So Dean Spade is an activist who just wrote a mutual aid book that just came out that is specifically mutual aid in the context of a pandemic and what it will look like during and after. And it's like $10. It's less than 100 pages, I think. Absolutely start there. That's the book you want to read. You can get it instantly. It's an ebook download from Verso Books, I think. So go ahead and get that if you're really curious about learning the ideological and philosophical underpinnings of why we even do this in the first place.
So it's Verso Books, and it is what's the author's name?
Dean Spade.
Of course, it's not right on their front page, but I will make sure that
I might be misremembering.
Oh, no, there it is. Mutual Aid, Dean Spade, found it. All right, I'm going to link to this in the chat real quick, but I'm also going to make sure that this gets into the description on the YouTube later and goes out for everyone so they can see this. This book is coming highly recommended by someone who you just heard actually not only knows what they're talking about, but is putting it to real use out there in the world here local to me. I want to thank James for coming on. This was amazing. I really appreciated all of this. The episode will go live on YouTube tomorrow. Anyone who has any other questions, feel free to ask. I'm sure this isn't the last time we'll have James on. There's all kinds of things we could talk about. It is, again, very surprising how connected our pasts are. But there we go. All right, everyone. Everyone in the chat, I'd like to say good night for our first early episode. Don't expect too many of these. 2.5 hours is going to be the average. All right, guys. Good night, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you, guys.